Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the ACT branch of the Australian Institute for International Affairs webinar. My name's Desmond Woods, and I'll be your host this evening. I'm not quite sure how many of you there are online, but you're all very welcome to Canberra, wherever in Australia you're beaming in from. It's crisp down here, I can tell you. Our guest this evening and our speaker is Gregory Raymond. He is a lecturer at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre researching Southeast Asian security, as well as convening the ASEAN Australia Defence Postgraduate Scholarship Programme. He is an editor of the journal Security Challenges and is ANU press editor for the Asia Pacific Security Series. Greg holds a PhD in political science from La Trobe University and an MA in Asian Studies from Monash Universities. Before joining the ANU, Greg was a policy advisor in the Australian government, including in the strategic and international policy areas of the Department of Defence and the Australian Embassy in Bangkok. He's the author of Thai Military Power, A Culture of Strategic Power, and lead author for the forthcoming book, The US-Thai Alliance and Asian International Relations, History, Memory, and Current Developments. I'll be very happy to take questions from you during the course of Greg's talk, which will go for about 30 minutes, and then I'll put those questions to Greg once he has concluded his main address. Greg, over to you.
Thanks very much, Desmond. And the topic of my talk tonight, and the title of my talk tonight, is Jagged Sphere, the Geoeconomics of Mainland Southeast Asia and Southern China. The idea of spheres and spheres of influences, of course, is an old one. It was written about by the great political thinker Hedley Bull in his book, The Anarchical Society. And there he talked about a couple of different types of spheres of influence. He talked about the spheres of influence of the colonial powers, where the colonial powers essentially gave each other free rein in their designated spheres to colonize as they would. The second type was the kind of sphere of influence that we saw during the Cold War, when governments in a particular sphere of influence, whether that be South America for the United States or Eastern Europe for the Soviet Union, was subject to coups and military intervention should their governments be seen to be politically unpalatable. In the world we inhabit today, in this part of the post-Cold War era, what we're seeing in mainland Southeast Asia, if we do see a sphere of influence, is a geoeconomic sphere of influence, largely guided by economic levers rather than the threat of military force. So when we think of mainland Southeast Asia, one of the first things that jumps out is this huge asymmetry between China's economy, the world's second largest, and the fact that mainland Southeast Asia has 3 of the world's least developed countries. So that in itself draws a lot of attention and draws, I guess, assumptions that this part of the world will become a Chinese sphere of influence. And of course, many commentators have already sort of made that pronouncement, including my own colleague Paul Dibb, and Gareth Evans making similar comments. And when we see developments like Cambodia essentially spoiling the 2012 ASEAN conference, basically stymieing the production of a communique, and it seemed to be linked to China's economic largesse, I think this brings many people to the conclusion that we're already seeing this sphere of influence manifest. Most recently, the arrival of the Belt and Road Initiative and the infrastructure projects that are going under the auspices of the BRI is leading some commentators to talk about the implications of that new connectivity. And one of the region's most astute observers, I think Bilahari Kausikan, the former Singaporean diplomat, recently stated that China's summed up the effect of infrastructure in this way, that the natural gravitational pull of China is being enhanced by infrastructure projects. And these, he suggested, could have geopolitical consequences even if not intended. They could merge Southwest China and mainland Southeast Asia into one economic space, making international boundaries remain only as lines on maps and otherwise relegated to inconveniences or irrelevancies. So what I want to argue tonight is this changing strategic geography is indeed important. I don't think there's any way that we can dispute that. But what I want to say is that if we do see a geoeconomic sphere of influence emerging at this point, and even in the near future, it's not going to be the round, smooth sphere that that term suggests, but rather it will be quite contested and uneven and fragmented. And I will suggest that it could be contested and fragmented in four particular ways. First of all, there's the contestation of other great powers and other regional actors. Secondly, there's a great deal of unevenness of China's influence and economic influence across and between the countries of mainland Southeast Asia. Thirdly, even within particular states in mainland Southeast Asia where China's economic pull is being felt the most, it's very fragmented, and there are pockets where that economic influence is in very tangible and powerful forms, and other parts of those countries it's much less. And finally, the nature of Chinese investment, and here I mean investment not only from the PRC but from other ethnically Chinese polities such as Singapore and Hong Kong, although that of course is now quickly becoming indisputably PRC. That fragmentation also means that this sphere of influence is a jagged one. So let me take you through these arguments. First of all, I just want to emphasize that strategic geography is very important. What we're seeing at the moment through these economic corridors under the BRI is that the countries of mainland Southeast Asia are being linked to China's infrastructural network, which is a massive network of road and railroad. Recently, I was doing field work in northern Laos, in a small town called Luang Nam Ta, which is one of the larger towns in northern Laos, and was in a restaurant when a car pulled up outside. And out of that car, two young gentlemen got out, came into the restaurant and ordered food. And they were judging by the number plates from the PRC. My colleague who was with me there and who is a fluent Chinese speaker engaged these two young gentlemen. And it turned out they had driven from Harbin continuously, Harbin being in the northern part of the PRC, all the way down across the border and into Laos. They spoke Lao, and it appeared that they had quite strong connections, and probably we would imagine business connections in Laos. So these new land connections in historic terms are something which are really, really unprecedented. For millennia, the borderlands between China and mainland Southeast Asia were at the fringes of states and empires. This was because of the mountainous topography and the complex ethnic makeup, which meant that empires and kingdoms in both parts of the world, mainland Southeast Asia and China, found it difficult to incorporate these parts of the region into their states. And so infrastructure grew very slowly, if at all. And in the 19th century, it was quicker to sail to Paris from Saigon than travel overland to Luang Prabang in Laos from Saigon. When we had the states emerge after decolonization and they started to build their own infrastructure, they tended not to link their countries. So we had a very fragmented transport infrastructure network. We saw with the end of the Cold War the beginnings of linkages, and Australia was involved in that with creating the Friendship Bridge that went between Vientiane and Thailand. So now we're seeing acceleration of these linkages between China and mainland Southeast Asia, and it is significant. So will that automatically by itself bring a more Sino-centric pattern of economic activity? Will it make mainland Southeast Asia a Chinese sphere of influence? Well, this is where I think looking at some of the geoeconomic data is actually helpful and might make us pause for a moment about assuming that this is going to happen rapidly. I think one of the first statistics which I think is important to realize is that trade within this sub-region still is quite a small proportion of total trade. And it's grown quite glacially since the beginning of the post-Cold War era, from 2% to about 9.5% of the sub-region's trade share. So there's still not a great deal moving between the 5 countries and the 2 provinces of southern China, that is Guangxi and Yunnan. We might also note that the openness, the trade openness of the region, which I'll come back to again, is such that places like Thailand and Vietnam are very, very connected by sea. 3 of the world's top 50 busiest ports by volume are in Thailand and Vietnam. So land borders and land connectivity are still dwarfed in some senses by the sea connectivity. Now, I want to come to other reasons which mean that China's influence through these new BRI corridors is not guaranteeing a sphere of influence. Firstly, we should think about this being quite a contested space. Now, people often forget that it was Thailand that emerged from the Cold War with the best infrastructure and the biggest economy. And for that reason, Thailand actually saw itself as the natural leader, and it had its own vision of becoming a kind of mini hegemon, seeking a kind of sub-regional dominance. This was part of the Thai policy, sometimes known as Suvarnabhumi, more often known as turning battlefields into marketplaces. And we can see that Thailand's economy really was dwarfed all of the other mainland Southeast Asian economies, and also Guangxi and Yunnan straight after the Cold War. But this, of course, this economic vision is increasingly out of reach because of the development and growth of Guangxi and Yunnan. So Thailand, almost 3 times both Guangxi and Yunnan's GDP in 1990. By 2017, Guangxi and Yunnan are almost the same as Thailand's economy. So they're catching up. And there is a feeling in Thailand that, the role that they used to have as being the provider of public infrastructure, being the source of knowledge and technology for their poorer neighbours, they do note they are now being displaced. So that is a source of contestation that is probably less important now. But more importantly, and what remains important, is Japan's role as the other key investor in mainland Southeast Asia. Japan's long been interested in pursuing a kind of neoliberal vision for mainland Southeast Asia, and that's why it founded the Greater Mekong sub-region. Now, the Greater Mekong sub-region is a forum for agreeing projects. It doesn't necessarily fund projects, but of course, Japan does fund many projects itself. And at the moment, it's the most significant financier of infrastructure outside of the PRC. David Dollar recently noted that it was Japan who was committing 13 billion over those 3 years compared to Western donors, none of whom reached more than 1 billion per year. So Japan, because it leads the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, and also is strong in the Greater Mekong sub-region, it's funding many east-west corridor projects. And I think this is important to note, that these east-west corridor projects here, one of them, which will go from the coast of Vietnam to the coast of Myanmar, it's almost complete now. These eventually may mean that there's connectivity with the Indo-Pacific's other main rising power, which is India. And of course, when we to come back to this point about trade openness, of course, although Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar are increasingly dependent on Chinese investment for trade and for export markets, they still look strongly to the United States and also Europe. And this is particularly true for Cambodia and Vietnam, and to an extent, Thailand, where US is very close behind China as an export destination. All right, let me turn to my second type of, I guess, unevenness within the Mekong countries. Now, it's clear that China's presence and influence is much, much greater in Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar than it is in Thailand and Vietnam. Now, I'll spend a little bit time just on Thailand, a country I probably know better than Vietnam. Thailand's often, I think, mistaken for being very accommodating, and certainly it is on occasion accommodating. It didn't go with a United States proposal for atmospheric testing in 2012 because it didn't want to have any perceptions that it was spying on China. And it does accommodate other requests that Beijing will make. But we've also got a note on infrastructure. It's going quite slowly on its own leg of the Kunming to Singapore rail project. That rail project is going to reach Vientiane from Kunming quite soon. At the moment, though, there is no firm plan for continuing that on through Thailand. Instead, Thailand's funding its own internal projects, such as the Eastern Economic Corridor project. It's also refused to blast the Mekong River rapids. That was something Beijing was looking for. It wanted to allow 500-ton vessels to move down that river. But Thailand did that quite diplomatically and subtly. It just said there were environmental concerns, local people didn't want that project, and so it hasn't gone ahead. Similarly, Thailand has been stalling on the canal project across the Isthmus of Kra that China's been proposing recently, and not turning them down directly, but simply commissioning yet another feasibility study. And of course, Thailand's also working on its own east-west corridors, looking to fund a road link from Myanmar to Kanchanaburi. Vietnam, of course, is better known as being suspicious of the BRI. It hasn't allowed Huawei into its 5G network. It's choosing Japanese infrastructure for its key projects, such as a high-speed railway between Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh. So Thailand and Vietnam are certainly much less subject to economic influence than the other three states. But of course, even within these states, we've got a lot of variation in the degree to which Chinese investment is changing these states. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about special economic zones because this is where China's influence is reaching its most dramatic forms. Forms in which we might argue there's a kind of extraterritoriality being implemented. These states are, in a sense, perhaps commodifying their sovereignty for broader economic goals. And one of the economic zones in Laos, in northern Laos, which is most striking in this respect, is the Bo Ten Special Economic Zone, which is right on the northern border of Yunnan province and northern Laos, right here with this blue dot is. This is some aerial photography of Bo Ten, and you can see here the China-Laos border. Now, Bo Ten's becoming a junction point because there's a highway which goes from Bo Ten down to Hue Sai, which is on the northern Thai border. So it allows goods to be transited from southern China into Thailand. And there is now a substantial flow of trucks. You can see here that the Bo Ten border crossing, there are quite a number of trucks here. Now, Bo Ten used to be a casino town. It's now becoming much more as part of the Lao-China high-speed rail project. We've got a massive redevelopment occurring here. And these are some photographs from recent fieldwork. And you can see the Chinese trucks, the old casino, and some of the newer buildings which are emerging. Now, we know that this project this special economic zone is linked to the financing of the high-speed rail project. We know that Laos still owes 1.1 billion even after having funded some of it by itself and borrowed some from China's Exim Bank. There is, a guess that Laos is going to pay this remaining figure essentially through large land concessions. So this is not a debt trap, but it is a kind of surrendering of large-scale land areas in exchange for the financing of the rail project. And these areas of land concession are all along the railway. So here's the high-speed rail being built at Borten. It would have progressed a lot further by now. This are some photographs. This is a diorama that we found in a hotel in Borten, which gives you some idea of the scale of the city, which is now being envisaged for Borten. It's truly huge and will house a very, very large population. Probably, most likely, wealthy Chinese looking for perhaps holiday getaways. There is a kind of romanticized view of Southeast Asia that I'll turn to in a moment. But here are some more indications that, in a sense, this will be a special economic zone where sovereignty is uncertain, that we have here a marking saying this is the tax point for China, and down here this is the tax point or tax border for Laos. Now, of course, all of this is within the sovereign territory of Laos, but this area is essentially being carved out of northern Laos. So it's a very significant development. There are concerns about what the social impacts will be. So far, many families have been forced to relocate, some 4,000. There hasn't been much compensation. And in our time there, visiting the small but growing Borten development, we didn't really see much evidence of any Lao doing significant running of businesses. They seem to be menial occupations, and all the language is Chinese, all the currency is Chinese. It does effectively seem to be a Chinese satellite city. Now, this is a billboard that I photographed in Yunnan, and it gives you some idea of this kind of romantic view that some wealthy Chinese have of Southeast Asia. They call it, you know, a dream of a Dai village. It's a pastoral dream. So, yeah, and these are some other statements that we see, I guess, from time to time amongst some of the bureaucrats in Yunnan. You know, the people in Southeast Asia are still at a starting stage of economic development. They're not aware of development, competition, openness. All of that needs to be improved. Now, let me just switch now to Myanmar, where there's also a very significant number of SEZs emerging. Most of these are being funded by Chinese capital, but Thailand and Japan are also funding their own. Some of these are manufacturing industrial centres. Others seem at this stage to be casino developments. And Geoeconomics is one that we also visited last year. Geoeconomics is right on the Thai-Burma border. It's opposite the town of Mae Sot. And it's interesting because it's a development that's grown up because of an agreement between a Chinese company and the Kayin Border Force, an ethnic armed organisation that's only loosely under the control of the Burmese state. Now, it's a very difficult trek to getting to Geoeconomics. From Miyawadi, it's a 5-hour drive on a terrible road. So at this stage, it might seem inexplicable that this big development funded by Chinese capital is springing up in the middle of nowhere. Here are some of the apartment buildings that are going up. And here we see a casino just emerging from the jungle. And there are more casino facades in Geoeconomics. This is one of the smaller gambling businesses that was in operation. But now we're beginning to see some evidence that we're seeing, in fact, the Geoeconomics development will eventually be much more than casinos. And I don't think this is necessarily widely known. Some reporting which is emerging in Thai language newspapers that we have here a 50-year lease, which may in fact allow a new city to be built. And this could house as many as 1 million PRC citizens. The plans seem to suggest another residential development on a scale similar, if not larger than Borten. Now, the yellow shape here, that area is roughly what is currently being developed. But when we look at the extent of what is being envisaged, we see something much larger. So that's the current area. What we see is 4 or 5, 6, 7 times larger, and extending all the way down the Thai-Myanmar border. And here again, we can see some of the kind of dioramas showing what's being envisaged. Very large-scale residential developments. The Thai sources seem to suggest that they're talking here about an industrial estate that will perhaps allow clothing manufacture for export to Western markets. But there does seem to be potentially also a strategic objective. And this, of course, will be familiar to strategic thinkers as being additional access to the sea as being a very significant objective for China, and particularly avoiding the Malacca dilemma, the over-reliance on energy routes through the Straits of Malacca. Now, what's the evidence for this? Well, there is some emerging. Some of the diagrams which appear to have come from the Chinese developers do clearly show Geoeconomics as a logistical hub linking land and sea routes. Now, we know also that there's a 160-kilometre motorway being built that will link Geoeconomics with a deep water port at Molomain. Now, whether or not this project actually is completed, we don't know. It's attracting increasing opposition from local groups, and Myanmar's government has now launched a review. And meanwhile, the ambassador to Myanmar, China's ambassador to Myanmar, has stated that it's not part of the Belt and Road Initiative. All right, so that's it for discussion SEZ. The last part of the talk, I just want to say that the Chinese state itself does mean that the nature of development, the nature of investment in mainland Southeast Asia can be very uneven and can be very varied. Now, there's a lot of fragmentation in the way in which the BRI is being implemented. There's not a lot of coordination between key agencies at national and provincial levels. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is only one agency. So many provinces essentially go ahead with their own policies, and this is certainly the case with Yunnan, which has led China's activities in CLMVT. It led with it's joining the Greater Mekong sub-region in 1992. And it's well known that Yunnan occasionally conducts its own foreign policy and only bothering to consult with Beijing sometime later. It started its own special border zones without the permission of Beijing. So similarly, the state-owned enterprises make their own deals. They don't really know much about local conditions. They break laws. They break both Chinese and local laws. They're not particularly concerned about social welfare or environmental outcomes, and they're quite comfortable with debt financing because that's the way they work in promoting development in China's own less developed provinces. The complexity, of course, is increased by Chinese groups from polities outside of the PRC. Now, in Cambodia, you have Singaporean companies running casinos. You have in Cambodia also Taiwanese companies working alongside those in the PRC in the clothing industry. So that does make the situation more complex. It also provides, though, I think, opportunities sometimes potentially for the PRC to try and disguise its involvement and perhaps its strategic objectives. And we've seen some evidence that with regard to Geoeconomics, the PRC is trying to shield or deflect inquiries or deflect assumptions that AIIA, the lead developer, is a PRC company. It's trying to show Geoeconomics as primarily a casino development and is arguing that AIIA is based in Bangkok or it's run by a Cambodian national. But really, these aren't supportable arguments. It's well known that AIIA is headquartered in Jilin, a northern PRC province. So just to conclude, there really is a security dilemma in a sense for the CLMVT states. They want to develop, they want to improve human security, but balancing national security against those human security needs is not easy at this point in time. We're seeing a lot of variation in China's economic footprint across this region. The stronger states, Thailand and Vietnam, will continue to try and position themselves as sub-regional leaders. And Laos, Myanmar and Cambodia in some ways will seek to balance between these two sub-regional aspirants and China itself. And of course, China's own economic heft means that, and political fragmentation means we're going to see hits and misses with their projects, some of them being rolled back like the Myitsone Dam, some of them going ahead, but there's no indication that it's going to be a very smooth rollout and conversion of this region to a Chinese sphere of influence. Of course, the high watermark would, of course, be a greater military presence in Cambodia, and that, of course, is something which is being watched keenly by all observers. And I guess this does leave us with this larger question, which is both theoretical and policy relevant, and that is, will flag follow trade? And I'll just leave it there, and we'll have some chat and some questions.
Thank you very much, Greg. Flag following trade is, of course, the expression that was used for empire in the days of European colonialism. Thank you very much. Well, we have 7 questions, which is excellent. We'll run through these and hope that other people can put theirs up, and we'll have some time for those as well. The first one is from Heath McMichael, the president of the ACT branch of the ANI, and he says, thanks, Greg. Your thesis that China presides over a geoeconomic sphere of influence, albeit jagged, implies that the trajectory of Chinese economic growth will continue. What if that growth cannot be assured or is challenged by other regional players like India?
Excellent point, and I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I think in some ways the future state of or the likelihood of a Chinese sphere of influence in mainland Southeast Asia is somewhat like the expectation that China's economy is going to surpass that of the US. Now, we all know that that's becoming more difficult for China because its economic growth isn't what it was 4 or 5 years ago, and as its economy slows, reaching that goal of overtaking the United States is going to become increasingly difficult. Now, I think that's quite possibly what might happen here in mainland Southeast Asia. We have the potential of having, I guess, white elephant projects that start and then don't complete. And we already see that in Myanmar. These economic corridors are only, I guess, fitfully and falteringly emerging. You know, I mean, Myanmar's regime doesn't necessarily want to accommodate all of China's wishes, even if it does want development. And so there's a stop-start kind of pattern of behavior with regard to many of these projects, where you have a project announced, and then very little actual progress. On the other hand, you can have sometimes very startling and phenomenally fast progress, which is what we've seen with the Laos Railway. But whether or not that's going to be replicated elsewhere in Myanmar, I think is much less certain. So I think I agree with you. There's no guarantees on this.
Thanks, Greg. Well, we've got another question which is on that similar point of pushback from Melissa Connolly-Tyler. She says, I've always been skeptical of China's South-South rhetoric, that its engagement with the developing world is fundamentally different from the West's. What you've presented tonight looks remarkably similar to what we've seen before and with the same predictable consequence. It may be just as likely to provoke anti-Chinese sentiment rather than a Sino-centric sphere of influence. What are your thoughts about that, Greg?
Oh, look, I agree. And this is part of why this geoeconomic influence is fundamentally different from previous spheres of influence. That is, the actors in mainland Southeast Asia are largely retaining political autonomy to wave through some projects and decide to cancel others. And they will, from time to time, I guess even taking into account they are authoritarian governments in all of these states, they will from time to time, for various reasons, decide that certain projects are not in their interest. And that may be because they start to feel overly beholden to China, or simply, as in the case of the Myitsone Dam, they're looking to I guess, try and bring that particular ethnic group on side, such as the Kachin Independence Army at that time. They didn't want to create another conflict. I mean, Myanmar's hanging together by a thread as it is. So from time to time, these authoritarian states will be responsive to local and social and environmental protests. And we've seen that also in Cambodia. But of course, at the same time, local elites in mainland Southeast Asia sometimes can't resist what's on offer, and so the projects can go ahead and with all those consequences that you're alluding to, Melissa.
Bryce Wakefield writes, thank you for the talk. A lot of the discussion has revolved, just a moment, just disappeared on me, just a minute, here we go. A lot of the discussion has revolved around the inducements that China can offer mainland Southeast Asia. Bilahari Kausikan, who you mentioned and who's speaking at the Institute next month, has recently written an article that suggests that Chinese position on the source of the Mekong means that it can dam the river, giving it significant leverage against these states. What do you make of this argument? Also, Kausikan argues that greater coordination of ASEAN states is a possible solution to this problem. I note you barely mentioned ASEAN in your talk. Is ASEAN a realistic actor in this issue?
Look, I think ASEAN is important, and also the river's important. I wanted to focus on this land linking infrastructure in this talk because I think that's an area that hasn't received enough attention. Look, ASEAN is one of the ways in which all of these states deflect and diffuse, I guess, too much Chinese co-optation. They're happy to join, I guess, the Lancang Mekong Forum, but there is a kind of game of forums going on here, and all of them are quite happy to be members of multiple forums because that dilutes the impact of the Lancang Mekong Sub-Regional Cooperation Forum. You know, Thailand's got its own CMAX, which is the Chao Phraya Mekong Ayeyarwady cooperative group, and of course ASEAN. It does remain, it remains supreme, and I haven't mentioned it much, but ASEAN has been very slow to really give much attention to Mekong developments, and I think there's an awareness of that amongst some in Singapore and in ASEAN, but I don't think it's really been addressed, and perhaps Bilahari was trying to, I guess, flag that what's going on in mainland Southeast Asia probably needs more ASEAN attention. Of course, the South China Sea tends to suck all the oxygen out of the room. On the Mekong, I agree, that's also dynamite for China, of course. It's already facing accusations that it lets water out or blocks water at times that suit it and not necessarily doing this in a very consultative way. Vietnam's got the strongest interest, of course, because of its reliance on the lower Mekong as a rice bowl, but also Cambodia. So, yeah, as has been, I think, said many times by various authors, this is a critical part of the story in mainland Southeast Asia. But I didn't want to focus there because I think it's getting a lot of attention already.
Sacha Blumen writes, there's been pushback on poor quality Chinese investment in Africa and other places. Is there similar pushback in Mekong countries?
Look, I think we probably yet to see some of the really big infrastructure projects brought to fruition, but I think that there is that potential down the line. I mean, I think this high-speed rail project, what they've accomplished in engineering terms is very impressive. It's 70% tunnel and bridge, but what's the longer term regime of maintenance going to be? And I think this is somewhere, this is a problem that we find probably in China as well as Africa and also mainland Southeast Asia, that unless there's a really well thought out sort of program of transferring skills to locals to ensure that these infrastructure projects, these services become able to be sustained over the long term, they could actually become white elephants, as I say, and something which actually tars Chinese reputation rather than enhances it. And I think it's too early to say where we are with regard to that story in mainland Southeast Asia.
Oh, and Swift has put a question which is relevant to what you've just been saying. In Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh City Railway project is backed by Japanese companies, but the project in Hanoi is being funded by a Chinese consortium. Can you speak to why this difference may be? Is it purely economic, or are there relevant factors regarding Chinese influence in northern Vietnam versus influence in South Vietnam?
That's quite possibly the case. It is the case in northern Laos and southern Laos. In northern Laos, it's Chinese investment, Chinese plantations, Chinese agricultural projects. In southern Laos, it's mainly Japanese funded. I'm not across what's going on in Vietnam. It's probably the country in those 5 states that I know the least about. I think overall, I wouldn't expect that to be the same as what's happening in Laos, simply because I think the Vietnamese government is taking a much, is walking a much finer line with regards to Chinese infrastructure because of the unpopularity of China in Vietnam. It's very easy for anti-Chinese sentiment to get out of hand. And I think even though the Vietnamese government still wants Chinese investment, they're very aware of that. So they walk a fine line, and they're also naturally suspicious. So I would tend to think it's that they want to balance their sources of investment rather than designating Hanoi as being, more of a Chinese sphere of economic influence. That, having said that, northern Vietnam, there is a great deal of trade being conducted across the border into southern China, into Guangxi province. A lot of trade done by small traders, and a lot of people in northern Vietnam relying on that economic situation.
Natalie Mobini asks, you mentioned the role of Japan. Do you have any comments about any current and future role by South Korea in the region? Does South Korea have a footprint there? And could it be another potential source of investment or development assistance?
I think there is early signs that South Korea is getting involved. They are involved in some of the forums. They are involved in some of the Mekong-related matters. But I don't think they are as yet significant investors. Certainly nothing on the scale of Japan. Perhaps that might change in the future, but I think they are interested in playing a part.
Robert Lowry asks, I can understand the Kra Isthmus Canal project, even though its strategic benefits are moot. However, the ESCO-CO project does not seem to make strategic or economic sense. Question mark?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very puzzling, curious, intriguing development. I think the only way it might make sense is if the railway developments, the railway plans, which are being flagged, but which are far from being finalised, if those actually come to fruition. Now, you've got the motorway going south from Geoeconomics to Mainland. So that's part of the sea-land bridge. What you want is some kind of rail or road linkage going up to Kunming. And there are plenty of efforts to get those linkages happening, even using the rivers. There's a constant stream of reporting about projects being proposed. The only difficulty is that the generals in Myanmar are proceeding quite cautiously, and you know, they're choosing which projects they allow to go ahead. They want the BRI. They're quite vocal proponents of the BRI, but they're sensitive to local interest groups as well. So I would see this as something that China wants to do over the long term. You know, my understanding, without being a China scholar, they're interested in an accretion of nuances. When they can move forward, they will, and there is the possibility that Geoeconomics could become some kind of useful logistics hub. So that's the only way I can kind of explain it, because at the moment it's quite bizarre.
An accretion of nuances is a great phrase, Greg. I'm going to steal that. It's better than the classic salami slicing with much the same result. I have two questions, both on the same subject, so I'll read them both. From Asha Naznin. Thanks, Greg. I was wondering if Thailand emerged from the Cold War as one of the biggest economic powers. What can Australia learn from it that would help us to rise further in this COVID era? Did the self-sufficient economy of Thailand play any role alongside other policies you mentioned? So that's his first question. The second question is, do you think that this pandemic era could be a great time when Australia could help Southeast Asian countries, as you mentioned, Laos, from this new kind of Chinese imperialism? And Jessica Collins just asked, thanks, Greg. How should the Australian government response be shaped? So you've got one question there about Thailand's self-sufficiency and whether there's any lessons to be learned, and the other is for Australia, and the other is how do we use these times to respond to the crisis?
Yeah, good questions. I think I'll answer the one about Thailand's economy first. I think there's an increasing realization in Thailand that they, you know, in a sense, they got lucky in the post-Cold War period. Not only had the US invested an enormous amount in building infrastructure right across the country, deep seaports and multi-lane highways linking the country, they were simply the only country that wasn't war-torn. So they stepped into a kind of vacuum, and they did very well. You know, they became the main destination of foreign investment in mainland Southeast Asia. Now, I think that luck is kind of running out, and I think there's a realization in Thailand that you know, their economic growth was bad even before the pandemic, and now it's terrible. It's amongst the worst in ASEAN. And look, this is hurting them, and they don't quite know what to do with it. They're kind of stuck in this middle income trap, and at the moment it's becoming politically volatile because of the severe hardship that people are undergoing. Look, on Australia's policies, this is a really, really diabolically tricky thing. I don't think Australia can get involved and start saying, oh, you know, only accept projects if they, you know, they measure up to these standards of good governance and, you know, triple bottom line and whatever. You know, I don't think that's going to work if we kind of take a moralistic attitude to what sort of investment the Southeast Asian countries, mainland Southeast Asian countries, want to accept. You know, it's quite similar to, you know, our position vis-a-vis the Pacific in some ways. We have to be a country which is there to be a source of advice, to be a dialogue partner, but we cannot, you know, seem to be kind of somehow prescriptive unless we're actually injecting funds into development ourselves. You know, there's a huge infrastructure gap in Southeast Asia. we're not doing a lot to fill it. The United States is doing a little bit more than it did, but still not very much. And so if, Australia and the United States just kind of carp about, the poor projects that China's offering, it's not a really good look. So I think that's a tricky line that we have to offer. We're talking about this blue dot project where we somehow certify good projects. Well, I think, I'm not really sure how that's going to go, because I think it does carry this kind of paternalistic undertone about it. So, I think the thing we need to do is just keep talking in a very sort of down to earth and non-condescending way, and these countries are going to have to sort through the problems themselves, which they are doing.
Bradley Innes writes, thanks, Greg. Do you believe that local populations have any influence over their state governments if Chinese developments start to have negative impacts on local people's way of life? And I just add to that, is there any appetite for the defense of the environment in these places, or are we going to see increasing destruction of the natural habitat?
Yeah, I mean, with all these countries, either under dictators or, governments which are backed by the military, we're not seeing a huge amount of accountability. But having said that, from time to time, local protests do, as I said earlier, attract the attention of central governments, and central governments will decide that they're going to, I guess, throw the locals a bone, if you like, by perhaps deciding, listening to their environmental concerns. I mean, there are environmental movements. I'd say that's much more something you'd find in Thailand, simply because Thailand's relatively wealthier. You've got middle-class groups now who are more concerned about the environment. And you've seen that in northern Thailand, where the Mekong Rapids really met with a huge the Mekong Rapids blasting initiative really met with a huge degree of opposition from people in northern Thailand who, so the local fishermen got together with environmentalists, and they really put a lot of vocal opposition against that project. So the environmentalism, it's strongest in Thailand, but even there, it's probably not as strong as other parts of the world. So, development is still king, really. Yeah, so it's not ideal, but I do think that with some of the examples, case studies like Myitsone Dam, we've seen that local opposition can have an impact.
Heath McMichael asks, to what degree is warlordism and local corruption on the part of local CLVMT players a complicating factor in China's plans?
Oh, it's a very big factor in Myanmar. I don't think it's really a factor in the other countries, because they're under the thumb. I mean, the Lao Communist Party, the Vietnamese Communist Party, the Cambodian People's Party, they are strong actors without much opposition. But Myanmar's like Swiss cheese. There's very fragile, tenuous control from Naypyidaw, and this is why you get a project like Geoeconomics that's being negotiated by the Cayenne Border Force directly with a Chinese company. Naypyidaw might have had some involvement in it, but it seems to have been a deal stitched up primarily by that local ethnic armed organization. And you see that all over Myanmar, particularly now, of course, Rakhine State, where you have now the Arakan army opposing Myanmar's army, and that, China's getting involved and either playing a role as attempting to try and, be a peacemaker, or alternatively and more insidiously, according to some sources, it's providing arms to the secessionist or to the insurgent groups, and that's well established with the Wa state up in Shan, up in the Shan state in the northeast. So yeah, Yunnan province can play. There's a lot of potential for it to exploit these fissures in the Myanmar state, but at the same time, it can get burnt by these problems as well. And I think, you know, China's built a pipeline from Jiaopu up to Kunming. That pipeline goes through this war-torn state of Rakhine, and I think there must be concerns about the security of that pipeline now with a conflict occurring. So it's a difficult. I think it offers opportunities, but also threats.
I'll make mine the last question, I think, as we're approaching 7 o'clock. To what extent, Greg, are these casinos really just Trojan horses, and to what extent are they just money-making enterprises?
Well, great question. I think I'm beginning to incline to see them as a kind of perhaps a ruse to deflect attention from what are, you know, ultimately bigger visions. Certainly, Bolten is way beyond just being a casino now, and it looks like that's the vision for Shuigogo as well. So we've seen some articles written by, I guess, certain writers who try to focus on that, and it seems like this is a deflection tactic. I guess, you know, one is led to think that perhaps there's some kind of disinformation going on at times.
Thanks, Greg. I think we'll wrap it up at that point. There have been some very good questions, and I thank you to all those who sent them in. And I thank you very particularly for your depth of knowledge and your excellent presentation. The slides and the maps in particular made a huge amount of sense to me. The complexities of the region are boundless, and clearly you're an academic who's deeply enmeshed in this developing story, which is so important for us living as we do to the south of what is now the near north, not the far east. Very many thanks, Greg. I really appreciate your time, and I believe that this will be available on YouTube in the near future through the AIIA website. So thank you very much for your
Thanks, Des. Thanks for hosting, and thanks to the AIIA. It's been great to get a chance to talk on this research.
Good. Thank you.